Here's what you know from before. Locke's state of nature is much more benign, much less harsh than Hobbes's was. In fact, it seems like a pretty pleasant setting, all things considered, especially when Locke says in the reading, in your text, such things as, the difference in tacit reference to Hobbes. He says, some people think that the state of nature is a horrible setting, but it's as different from a state of war, which is of course how Hobbes described it, as would be a state of reason, peace, comfort. I mean, he uses words like that. I'm not quoting him exactly, but he really gives you the impression that he thinks that the state of nature would be very, very nice. So the question arises, okay, why leave it if it's all that good? And you'll remember it comes out that for Locke, there are certain deficiencies in the state of nature. What were they? Number one, there were three. It's a good review. Yes? Any one of them is okay.
There's no indifferent judge.
Okay, that's number two.
Yeah.
No known indifferent judge. In other words, unbiased. We use that term. We use the term indifferent in a way that might be a little confusing in this context nowadays. But what what Locke meant was that there was no known unbiased judge. There's no mechanism in particular. There's no way of being sure that the person who makes a decision, or an arbitration, if you're trying to get somebody to make a decision in a conflict you have with somebody else, there's no way to be sure that the person that you choose is going to be fair. And it's really tough for the people who are actually in the conflict to make a fair judgment. Each person in the conflict, of course, sees things their own way. They may both think that they're doing things rightly. They may both think that they're interpreting the law of nature properly. What are the others? There's 1 and 3 yet. This is a matter of reasoning. You can figure this out, I think, just sort of remembering basically what Locke says. We've got number 2. There's no known indifferent judge. What other deficiencies are there in the state of nature?
It can be interpreted in different ways.
Yeah, there's no agreed interpretation. Of the law of nature, if you like, or I'm going to put it this way: the law of reason. It's just an expression he uses synonymously with law of nature. I remember for Hobbes there was there's no principles of right and wrong, no law at all in the state of nature. But Hobbes thought that you could, or Locke thought, I keep doing that, be careful here. Locke thought, both these guys have these simple little monosyllabic last names. They get Black, like Hobbes, Black. Nothing easily memorable like Aristotle, right? But I want you to keep them distinct. For Locke, there is a set of rules that reason can identify implicitly if you just consider what human beings need, what they're like, what the situation is. You can just figure that out using common sense, using reason. They are God-given. This is interesting for Locke, but this is only, I mean, the way that you know that they're God-given is because God set things up like this, right? I mean, basically what you're doing in trying to figure out what the law of reason says should be the rules guiding the relationships between people as they interact. What reason does is looks at the way things are. I mean, basically, you have to figure out, well, what's human nature like? What are people like? What are their needs? What are their abilities? What are the resources we have here? If resources were infinite, there'd be no problem. Everybody could have what they want. But since resources are scarce, that's just a fact of life. We have to figure out some way of deciding who gets what. And so what should be the basis of that? What's the right way of doing this? You also don't want to, I guess there's this one implicit norm, that is that humanity should be preserved. And Locke thinks that that has its normative power. It gains its shouldness, its oughtness, its rightness from the fact that God obviously wanted humanity to flourish, or else God wouldn't have created humanity. So there's something that it's hard to remove that norm. But if, whether or not you think that there's a God that willed that humanity should survive, if you think that humanity should survive, that's a good thing, that's something worth considering when trying to figure out what you should do and what rules should be in place in the world, if you agree with Locke on that score, you could probably go along with him on everything else he has to say without necessarily agreeing with him about the theology, about God being behind it all. All you need is to agree with him on the facts of the matter, that, you can't survive unless they eat, and they can't eat unless they mix their labor with stuff, and humanity can't flourish and survive unless the individuals do. And it's a good thing that humanity should survive. If you agree with him on all those points, even if you don't agree with him on the theology, it seems to me you can go a long way with him in his dissection of the state of nature. He does think that there's a law of nature that's recognizable, a law of reason that's recognizable in the state of nature. The problem is, though, that in one's own case especially, one's likely to be biased in interpreting it. And the two people can be as honest as you please in claiming that they are only trying to abide by the law of nature. They can still get into conflicts. Because two people get into conflicts out there in the world, it doesn't mean that one of them is a liar or one of them is a cheat. You can get conflicts between well-meaning people who are just interpreting things differently. They just see things differently. And that's the problem with the state of nature that's mentioned in number 1. There is a law of reason, but there's just no universally agreed upon interpretation of that law. Especially when you're trying to decide individual cases. It would be difficult indeed, even once you've got a state, once you've even got society, once you've even got lots of this stuff written down, it's still difficult to figure out who's been breaking a law and who hasn't. Because the laws have a lot of leeway. And must have a lot of leeway. They can't foresee all the details about all the particular cases that they'll have to be applied to. But that could be somewhat resolved if we could at least agree on some of the general lines of the law of reason. That would be an advantage. That would relieve one of these deficiencies. What's the third deficiency? Do you remember? There's no agreed upon interpretation of the law of reason. There's no known and indifferent judge. The other one's pretty logical also.
No consistent enforcement.
Right, there's no consistent, reliable means of enforcement. Now, the reason I want to repeat all this stuff is because the very thing that each of these thinkers sees as the problem with the state of nature pretty much accounts for what they see as the solution. For Hobbes, we got to have some way of stopping civil war, and we want a guaranteed way of stopping civil war. Civil war is awful. It tears everything apart, and that's what you get when you don't have an efficient, reliable leviathan, a state, a government. So what we really need to do is to pull out all the stops and do whatever we need to do to make sure we don't get civil war. It's a constant risk. We've got to avoid it. Best way to do that is to make sure that some one person or small number of persons who are able to suppress the conflicts among us, we just sort of say, all right, you've got the power to do that. You do what you want with it, as long as you keep us out of civil war. The only one qualification that Hobbes offered to that, and I don't know if we dwelled on this, but I want to make sure it gets out there. The one qualification for Hobbes is that, like no matter what power you give to the Leviathan, nobody can be interpreted as giving away their right to life. Everybody retains their right to self-defense. And you have a right anyway, once you've given away all, most or all your power, you have a right if the Leviathan now comes back and says, okay, I want you to kill yourself. You have a right to say no and to struggle and fight and do whatever you can to protect yourself. Of course, if you've given away most or all of your power, that may not be very much. I mean, that's a problem there. But no one can interpret your agreement to establish the state, this is still Hobbes, as giving away your natural liberty to do what you can to survive. You haven't given that away. Well, but again, Hobbes' deficiency suggests that we should have a monarch of nearly totalitarian power. Locke's, on the other hand, he just sees deficiencies in the state of nature that needs correction. He lists what the deficiencies are. What we need, plainly, is something that takes care of these deficiencies. So what would? We need to have, number one, what do we need? I mean, just logically. I mean, right now we've got everybody out there in the state of nature just trying to figure out what reason dictates, what we need to resolve the problem that there's no agreed interpretation of the law of reason. What would solve that problem?
You need a body.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
You need a body of people.
You need a body of people?
Well, you need a group or people that can interpret the laws.
Maybe, but what do you need?
You need the laws.
You need written laws. I mean, you need an agreed upon interpretation. So how about just putting in written laws, and then how you do that may be a matter of practical. So I'll put this in bracket. Written law would be great. I suppose if you also, here's another thing that actually has a great background in England. It's not always written down. There might be a common law tradition. If you could develop some kind of legal tradition, legal institutions wherein everybody really does kind of know what the law is. It may or may not be written down, but it's something that's passed along. As long as there is an agreed upon interpretation of the law, whether it's embodied in a piece of paper or a book or a document, or whether it's embodied in an institution which always says whatever the last 16 judges said, I'm going to say that too. Unless there's some really special about this case. I mean, that need not be written down, the common law tradition. There has to be some means of communication with what the last 16 judges did. But that's sort of like it's a traditional law. It's a law that grows through the accumulation of traditions. And those things might change, but they change real slowly. But written law would do it, but you need some interpretation of the law of reason. How would we solve 2? It's pretty plain. What
Get a person to be the judge.
our person, or at least some sort of institutional arrangement, I'm going to say a judicial system. where everybody knows who the judges are. There are guys that wear these particular clothes, they work in particular, I don't know how you're going to do that, but you're going to have some sort of judicial system. And then what do you do down here for number 3?
Somebody enforce the law.
How about police force? I'll just put that as an abbreviation. Good. What this yields is something that's called, traditionally, the idea of the night watchman state. Okay? The night watchman state. It's very, very minimal. The idea here is if what we need, if the reasons for moving from the state of nature to civil society are these 3, if that's what the reasons are, if that's why we would have any reason at all to move away from the otherwise benign state of nature, then we're asking very specific and very limited tasks from the state we create. We want them to solve these 3 problems. The night watchman state that is defended by Locke and is defended even more vehemently by many of Locke's followers, close to Locke in time and right up to the present day, it got the name classical. This might surprise you. This is classical liberalism. This is the original doctrine that took the name liberalism. What's liberalism known for in contemporary American political dialogue? What's associated with liberalism? And liberalism has actually become a term that liberals will not use very often to describe themselves. What does liberalism come to mean? It's a pejorative, but what's it come to mean in contemporary politics, as of, let's say, Ronald Reagan days? What do you associate it with? I can't hear you. Conservative. No. What do you associate with the term liberalism? I don't want its opposite. I want to know, what does liberalism mean to you? Dan. What would you? I mean, if someone says that someone says that so and so is a liberal, what does that mean?
The views are very towards people, I guess.
Pardon?
Their views tend towards the individual more so than the state.
Really? Is that the way you understand liberalism in contemporary political dialogue? Somebody else. This surprises me. Pardon? Openness. Now, I think maybe you think of yourself as a liberal. I would like to hear what liberalism means from someone, not necessarily who thinks that they're a conservative, but what conservatives successfully demonized this word during the 1980s by tying liberalism with.
Liberals are always open to new ideas.
Man, you guys are too. You're not doing what I'm asking you to do. That doesn't demonize liberalism, does it? That makes liberalism sound okay, doesn't it? That they're open to new ideas.
They create chaos.
Huh?
They don't have a path. They just go with the flow.
If you were to tune in Rush Limbaugh, right? He's one of those who
He hates them.
That's right. They demonize. See, the word demonize means make a demon of. What's the character?
Maybe they support like social programs.
Social programs.
Hands involved with the people and stuff.
There's 2 words I'm looking for. Big government. I mean, what conservatives successfully have associated liberals with is the idea of big government, not entirely without justification. Welfare, the idea that everybody should should be assured of at least some basic economic benefits forever. I mean, with no limits. Like if you're poor, if you're having hard times, government should see to it that you don't starve. Government should see to it, perhaps, that people should have a basic education. Government should see to it that everybody has equal opportunity. Government should make sure that all of these things happen. And since that requires government programs, there should be there should be greater fairness in the distribution of wealth in society. That's often not always, associated with contemporary or more recent versions of liberalism. These things require government programs, and the government programs tend to be pretty large. So what those who are not at all liberals in this sense, people who criticize this way of thinking about what the state should do, have associated with liberalism the idea of big government. What I'm trying to indicate to you here is that originally, the original liberalism was just the opposite. Government should satisfy just a few basic functions. Basically, it's police, justice system, military. We should be protected from foreign enemies. We should be protected from criminals within. There should be a justice system to make sure that that this is done fairly. The justice system will make the laws, among other things. It'll also pass the judgments. And so here you get a legislature, okay, maybe in our contemporary society, you get a legislature, judicial system, and an executive branch whose job is really pretty narrow. Just to get these things done, make sure the laws are enforced. And that's it. That's the night watchman state associated with the classical notion of liberalism that dates back at least to John Locke and those ideas that you had there. Also associated with classical liberalism, classical liberalism involves the idea of the night watchman state. Also, laissez-faire, whoops. Economics, I'll put. Is typically associated with classical liberalism. What does laissez-faire economics mean to you? Laissez-faire. Stuff that's out there in the world, yeah.
Like survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest. What does it mean literally? That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's that's not specifically what the idea is. You're not wrong, but I want more.
Well, that means free to do or to be.
You know what the words mean, anybody?
Leave alone.
Leave alone.
So pretty much they could go about
Economics should be left alone.
as they choose.
Should be no state interventions in the marketplace. No regulation. No tariffs. If you need to tax, you tax. Not business in particular, but you might tax the citizenry in order to support these spare functions. But the government doesn't support any particular industries or businesses, doesn't encourage such things as minimum wage, doesn't intervene in the marketplace at all, doesn't support labor in disputes it might have with management, but on the other hand doesn't support management in disputes it might have with labor. Doesn't regulate industry. That's double-edged. It doesn't tell industry, you may not, probably won't, it may not tell industry even, you may not pollute. But on the other hand, it won't tell industry, you may pollute up to this point. Doesn't have anything to say about price. It lets the market determine price. Now, what are the reasons likely to be offered for advocating laissez-faire economics? Or what, I shouldn't say likely to be, but the reason I said likely to be, because I'm guessing that some of you may not have thought about that much, but what reasons do you suspect might be offered in behalf of the idea that we should leave the economy alone?
More people will be willing to join into the economy.
More people will be willing to join in the economy if it's left alone.
I mean, it leads to like monopolization.
It leads
There's
to,
a problem with it.
okay, you're saying that a problem with laissez-faire economics, you say, is that it leads to monopolization. So that's a problem with it. But maybe you're having trouble seeing what the positive thing would be, since that's the way you understand laissez-faire economics. Do you really think that people think that numerically more people will participate if it's
left alone, if they're not taxed, if there's no downside to joining the economy?
Well, there's always, like, joining the economy. You join the economy when you buy something. You join the economy when you work. I mean, one thing that laissez-faire economists say is that if you don't have a minimum wage, more people will be employed. Is that what you mean? That sort of thing?
Well, yeah, and starting new businesses and such.
But businesses, as is well known, fail at least as often as they succeed, more often actually. But there would be larger numbers of people out there trying if there weren't some other alternative like welfare. Is that the idea? Okay, I think that is one of the arguments offered. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be just the faith that capitalism, the free market, if you leave it alone, is self-sufficient and has all these forces and balances in it that'll kind of keep it going and doesn't need it, and the second you jump in and you start interfering is when you mess it up?
The claim is, that the supporters of laissez-faire offer for the laissez-faire system is that it'll bring everybody up. It'll be a more productive economy than if the government tries to steer things one way or another. Now, we're going to come back to this theme later when we talk about Marx and then Hayek, two people on opposite sides of the ideological fence on the issue of what happens in capitalism. We'll come back to the sort of suggestion you offered about it. But for now, the reason for saying that the government shouldn't intervene in the economy has historically been that that's what will yield the most prosperous society. Whereas critics of the market say that the market makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. As we'll see later on, proponents of the market say, no, the rich get richer and the poor get richer. And that's better than everybody staying relatively poorer. That everybody's lot is improved. And so this is supposed to be, whether you buy it or not, this is supposed to be something that's good for the whole society, not just good for the rich. At least that's what those who argue for laissez-faire believe. Yeah.
So what influence would the government have? Does that mean flat out government has no influence in the economy?
Pretty much. Laissez-faire literally means leave it alone.
So what about support for the poor though?
None.
There is none?
Not from the government. And what is, laissez-faire. Now, look, if you depart from the night watchman state, I mean, there's got to be some way of supporting these things, right? If you really think that these are things that the state should do, there's got to be some way of paying for that. So you presume there's going to be some sort of tax system, some way of paying for it. If you want to expand that a little bit to include something of a safety net, for the people who are really hard up, well, as long as you've already got a mechanism for paying for these things, then why not that? So there's a lot of room to move from this extreme night watchman state. But taken quite, if you really want to explore what the night watchman state has to say, the classical liberal argument for the night watchman state is that it will do nice things for the society. It'll free people's potential. They will find the contracts and the things to do that will profit them most. More opportunities. That wasn't Locke's argument, though. Locke argued on the basis of natural reason and natural rights. People have a right to their property. People have a right to get as much property as they can acquire through mixing their labor, or later, once other people have mixed their labor with property, then you can get things by purchase, right? There's new ways of getting property, or gift, or inheritance. There's all kinds of different things. Someone voluntarily gives to you something that they mix their labor with. Well, that, on this general system of Locke's, that's fine too. The only provisos, you'll remember, had to do with whether the stuff was going to spoil, whether in the original acquisition the original acquirer had left as much and as good in common for others, and make sure that there was no use of this property that would violate the rights of others. That they couldn't be used as a sword or as a club to enslave people. But as long as those conditions are met, and then once money evolves, people can acquire as much as they want. And then the state is in there to preserve the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And property now is whatever they've acquired. This is all a matter of natural right and natural reason for Locke. When I start talking about things like, well, the reason for laissez-faire, the reason for a limited state, when I start saying the reasons for doing that is because they produce better consequences, I'm starting to argue in a way very different from Locke's. And that's going to bring us to John Stuart Mill. Mill, too, began his career anyway as a classical liberal, an advocate of laissez-faire, an advocate of something like a very small, minimal state. If you want to know who in the United States argues for something like the classical liberal night watchman state, does anyone recognize that doctrine as the doctrine of any people on the political stage? I'm sort of curious because they're not major players. Robert? Pardon?
Independent.
Maybe, but independent doesn't have much of a credo. It's just a collection of. There is a party though.
The Libertarian?
The Libertarian Party. It's divided. Actually, the party isn't divided, but libertarians come in two breeds: the anarchists and the minarchists. Both of them think that government is something that should be avoided if possible. The people, primarily, I think, the people in the party would agree that, well, we do need some kind of state, but it should be really, really tiny. And it should be, restricted to the mechanisms needed to prevent violation of rights. And rights are understood very much like Locke understood them. So they are the inheritors. The Libertarian Party, libertarians generally, are the inheritors of this more radical version of classical liberalism. But the liberals and the conservatives, modern liberals and conservatives, also have grown out of this tradition. This tradition, I mentioned that Locke is instrumental in influencing the thought of the founding fathers of our nation, and it's just Lockean ideas are found throughout the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We are a nation that's kind of born, I think, with a natural hostility to the government. I mean, that was the case when the country was first established. That continues to be something that puzzles Europeans when they try to understand American politics. Americans are not particularly fond of the idea of government. This is kind of in the political heritage. I mean, you find differences from American to American, of course, but if there were anything like a widespread natural political philosophy on the part of Americans, it would probably have a certain amount of hostility to government in it. Here comes April 15th in a couple of days. Just think of the widespread hostility to the government that begins to get generated around this time of the year. But Mill, beginning his career, in his own life, he begins to make the moves that changed liberalism from something that advocated a very, very minimal state to something that came closer and closer to socialism, that he himself even described as a kind of version of socialism later in his career. His own life spanned some of that development. Mill began as a classical liberal, so he agreed with Locke on what the state should be doing. Not very much. The thing that distinguishes Mill from Locke, in part because Mill is writing in the 19th century, sort of in the middle of the last century, whereas Locke was writing in the 1600s, 200 years earlier. Part of what distinguishes them may be experience with the very institutions that Locke had argued for. But Mill, along with his predecessors, this is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is the son of James Mill, who was a follower of the political philosophy of Jeremy Bentham. Actually, followers is okay. He was also kind of a co-creator. They are all utilitarians. Their reasons, they to varying extents supported the same kind of state that classical liberalism espoused. So they too can be understood as classical liberals, but their reasons for arriving at that conclusion are very different. Where Locke got to the conclusion that the state should be the small night watchman state, where he got to that conclusion on the basis of considerations of natural rights. Jeremy Bentham, on the other hand, said that the very idea of a natural right is nonsense on stilts. Wonderful, wonderful expression. It's just nonsense on stilts. It's crazy. There aren't any rights that are natural. Instead, for the utilitarians, what's right or wrong aren't things that you just sort of try and deduce from first principles or from God or for anything else like that. To figure out what's right and wrong, you want to know what produces the greatest good for the greatest number. If socialism, if it could be argued that socialism, something other than or a big welfare state, if it could be argued that that would indeed produce the greatest good for the greatest number, well, then that's what we should have. If, on the other hand, laissez-faire produces the greatest good for the greatest number, that's what we should have. So everything depends on empirical results. Everything depends on what actually happens in these systems. It's not just a matter of natural rights. And so that's where this argument that I've offered a few minutes ago, that's where this started to emerge. It's not just that people have natural rights. That's not the only reason why we should protect their property, and that's not the only reason why government should be limited. It's because doing things that way promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. It's the consequences that matter, not some natural rights. This is a consequentialist theory. As opposed to a rights-based theory, or as it's sometimes called, deontological theory. Don't worry about that here, but if you've ever come across the words deontology in some other philosophy course, I can't imagine where else you might ever come across it, but if you ever came across that word in another philosophy course, that's what it applies to, is the Lockean kind of idea that the way to understand how we should do things involves consideration of something like natural rights, which people may have regardless of the consequences. I mean, where this might come into conflict is if we say, look, I don't care what the consequences are to society. People just have a natural right to the fruits of their labor. That's the sort of thing that the rights-based or deontological part of us might be inclined to say sometimes. I don't care what the consequences are. They don't matter. People just have a right to free speech. People just have a right to live their lives the way they want to. Whenever you find yourself inclined to say that, or hear somebody else saying that, you're hearing the line of reasoning that's typical of a non-consequentialist, a deontologist, a rights-based theorist. But when people say, look, people may have a right to free speech, people may have a right to private property. People may have a right that their government be limited in all the ways that you say, but the reason for that isn't because of some like natural right. The reason for saying that is because of something yet deeper. Setting things up that way produces the best consequences. That's what a consequentialist says. And in particular, for the utilitarians, we should do those things and we should have those rules and we should have those institutions which produce the greatest good for the greatest number. This is where we are measuring their utility, their usefulness. Utility is just another word for usefulness in producing the greatest good for the greatest number. The things which maximize utility, where utility is measured by the ability to produce the greatest good for the greatest number, where utility is maximized, that's where we have the best social system. And then it'll be largely an empirical matter to decide, okay, now which system does that? Now you still get advocates for socialism, you still get advocates for laissez-faire, you still get advocates for something in between you might call the welfare state. But the whole ballpark is new. It's not based on natural rights, natural justice. It's based more empirically. It's based more on considerations of what do these systems actually do? What do they accomplish? So it means that the stakes of the discussion change considerably if you go from a debate among deontologists to a debate among consequentialists. Questions? All right. So let me just talk, I'm going to be talking about the early Mill. I've mentioned that he changed his mind about lots of things as he grew older, became more and more inclined to think that welfare institutions, a modest kind of socialism, might be preferable to the really limited state that Locke had espoused. He came to believe, so he became more and more of a modern liberal, if you like, in the course of his life. But I want to talk about the early Mill, both to show the similarities between Mill and Locke and the contrast. The similarity is they both believed in the same kind of state. They both agreed on what the state should look like. It should be minimal. It should be devoted mostly to solving the deficiencies in the state of nature that Locke had outlined. That's where they were similar. Where they differed was in their reasons for drawing that conclusion. Yep.
What was the lifetime of Mill again?
Mill has lived in the middle of the last century, so in the 1800s. He actually lived from the early to the late part of the 19th century. So he's writing this stuff more or less in mid-century.
Do you think that his change corresponded with, as now that American democracy and France and that had been established, as like stuff kind of showed through about what was working, what wasn't working?
I think so.
Led to his change?
I think so. And it really, I think that there's lots about the real live experience of a government set up on, at least in the first place, on Lockean lines, real life experience with democracy in particular, a democracy of our own unique variety. But it's the fact that there had been some experience with that institution steadily from 1789 onward. And by the middle of the 1800s, there's lots that could be said about what American society looks like. There's some reason to think English society was actually being influenced by developments in the United States. It was changing too. The influences went both ways across the Atlantic, but right from the time of the Revolution, there was a very strong sentiment in England among some political actors in behalf of the kinds of things that the Americans were standing for. And that, the whole idea of of democracy, actually, one can read even the prehistory of the American Revolution. Going back to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, one can argue that the whole trend in Anglo-American politics was toward more and more democracy, and that the American Revolution was just one more event in a bigger Anglo-American history. But our revolution and our Constitution and the success of our government, although we had a big civil war in the middle of the 19th centuries, but still, we came out of that all right. I'm not sure that Mill had time to put that into his equation, but there was a lot of evidence about what democracy would be like, how stable it could be, what results might come of it. There was some evidence about what, from economics also, is a lot different from the 1600s to the 1800s. Lots more apparent concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, sort of mechanism that was referred to over here. Lots more apparent concentration of poverty. Lots of reasons to think that maybe something should be done about that. And so, conditions have changed. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that hadn't been there 200 years previously. And I think that worked on Mill in lots of different ways. First and foremost, though, when you read On Liberty, what you see is an important theme that might not be apparent right away. What's the main theme of On Liberty? It's liberty, but what particular liberties? Freedom of speech. Before Mill, more or less, and even after Mill, the dominant concern, the dominant argument, I should say, for freedom of speech had to do with government-protected freedoms of speech. We must construct our government in such a way so that it doesn't violate freedom of speech. And maybe before there was a good long experience of democracy in action, at work, real democracy. I mean, before democracy was, prior to the American experiment, democracy either was something you referred to historically as having happened in Athens, or maybe some small-scale experiments here and there, but no long, sustained, big-scale experiments in democracy before America. So before the American experience, it was all kind of theoretical. Now, after the American experiment had been going on for some time by the middle of the 19th century, and what Mill picks up on, and this is what I want to talk about in the rest of what we say about Mill, what Mill picks up on is, it's important that you make sure that the government not suppress freedom of speech. That's vital. But there's a funny thing that goes on in democracies where people wind up having power, where people, large numbers of people are not just making legislation, but are pretty much influencing the day-to-day affairs of the nation. When that happens, there is another kind of suppression of individuality and free speech and reason that arises that's maybe even more pernicious, has worse consequences for the society than did mere government suppression of free speech. And that's the suppression of free speech that's done by popular opinion. It's the idea that people, by the influence they have over people's thoughts about themselves, just the idea that popular opinion suppresses individuality, creativity, suppresses speech. There's things that you can't say because public opinion will go against you. When public opinion is the weapon that's being used, and not just jails, or even instead of jails, public opinion actually winds up reaching into the very soul of the person whose opinions or speech is being suppressed. And in some ways, therefore, it's even worse. That's what he picks up on. So what we're going to talk about when we talk about On Liberty and Mill's discussion of freedom of speech, I want to make very, very clear. He's not specifically talking about reasons why we ought to have laws that protect free speech. He's trying to come up with reason and trying to explain why we have to be careful to try to keep our society not only tolerant of, but inviting free expression of divergent opinions. In On Liberty, Mill argues for freedom of speech, plainly. But the main focus of his argument isn't, as most of us would probably put it, it isn't that the reason we ought to have a law that protects free speech is that if I don't acknowledge your right to free speech, then I can't expect you to acknowledge mine. I mean, I think that's the kind of common consideration that most of us would offer for having things like the First Amendment be important parts of our social life. The idea that, like, I want to be able to express my own ideas, and I can't expect you to allow me to do that when we disagree if I don't let you do that too. Famously, there's lots of controversy surrounding just how far this right should extend. There's problems with pornography. There's problems that extend now to the internet, and exactly how much freedom should be allowed up there. But even just in the realm of stuff that's more political, there's been a lot of controversy in recent years. There's a case in particular that's pretty important in considering the issue of freedom of speech. Maybe I'm picking I'm going to talk about two cases. Both of them are examples that came up around Chicago, which is my hometown. Now, I think that they're pretty well-known cases, but maybe that I know these and keep using these because they were familiar to me when I was a kid and I was first thinking about these problems. But you might have examples that are just as good from other places. Back sometime in the 60s, and I don't even know what the dates were, but I'm pretty sure it was the 60s. Back sometime in the 60s, the American Nazi Party, I think it was, decided that they wanted to have a parade in Skokie, Illinois. Now, Skokie, Illinois, if you don't know about it, it may have changed. I mean, all these communities changed their demographics, but at the time that I grew up on the north side of Chicago, in a part of Chicago called Rogers Park. What happened was that the Jewish emigres, dominantly Jewish emigres during that period after World War II, of course, had moved from Europe, where they were plainly persecuted. They moved to some of the neighborhoods on the west side of Chicago, and then as some of them became more affluent, there was a sort of a series of communities that people would move to. Rogers Park was maybe one of the first ones. You'd move from the west side to Rogers Park, and then maybe out to Skokie, Illinois, which was a suburb on the north side of Chicago, and then maybe up to Highland Park if you became even more affluent. But this is sort of the path of affluence for people who came from Europe, became destitute, but slowly but surely began to make their way in American society. But Skokie, Illinois, by the late 50s and early 60s was predominantly Jewish. I'd say in the 90% range. And a surprisingly large number, percentage of that population were people who had actually escaped the Holocaust. They'd maybe been in the camps themselves. And so when the American Nazi Party said, we want to march through Skokie, Illinois, I mean, that wasn't just a coincidence that they chose Skokie, Illinois. They chose Skokie, Illinois because it was because its population was so heavily Jewish, and in particular, I suppose, because its population was not only Jewish, but was comprised of people who had been through the Nazi period in Europe. Now, the town council or whatever it was in Skokie, Illinois, naturally didn't like this idea. They said, well, no, of course, you can't march here. Why don't you march in Chicago? I mean, Chicago's a bigger city. There's many more parks and streets and stuff like that. And plainly, you're going to do a great deal of psychological damage to the residents of Skokie, Illinois. Some of these folks have been through an awful lot. They've lost family members, and so we just don't want to allow you to march. But the American Nazi Party answered, no, we don't want to march in Chicago. We want to march in Skokie. I mean, we need to make our point. And our point has to do with our philosophy. We certainly won't be bearing arms. We will be nonviolent. We intend only to march through the public streets, as we have every right to do. And we wish to assemble and have a rally in the town square, in the public town square. And this is all public property, and we are entitled to do this. This is our right. It's our right to speak freely and our right of freedom of assembly. And while we understand we need a parade permit, we are applying for that parade permit. And you have an obligation to grant us that parade permit, provided we qualify with all the normal rules. And they did. They were very careful to qualify and to satisfy all the normal rules that you had to satisfy if you were to get a parade permit in Skokie, Illinois. Well, the town tried to say no, and the American Nazi Party decided that it would take its case to the American Civil Liberties Union. Now, this is a cause célèbre. It was a very well-known case because the American Civil Liberties Union, of course, has always stood for trying to stand up for the rights of minorities. And at that particular time, it was important that the American Civil Liberties Union stood up for the rights of the black population. And they also were very active in standing up for the rights of the Jewish population. And the American Nazi Party came to the American Civil Liberties Union and said, we're a minority too. We've got rights under this Constitution too. And if you really do stand for principle, American Civil Liberties Union, you should take our case. And while it probably produced a great deal of anguish, even to the very attorneys who were assigned to the case, the ACLU did take that case. They took that case because, in fact, it was the right of the American Nazi Party to march and to assemble in Skokie, Illinois. Now, the ACLU lost a lot of contributions over this decision. A lot of people who had been big supporters of the ACLU said, I'm sorry, we can't support you any longer. The ACLU, though, felt that it had to take this case because, indeed, it was a matter of principle. So they took the case, and of course they won it because the Constitution plainly says that the American Nazi Party does have the right. Now, I need to find out from you before we go on much further what you think of this. This is what the right of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly comes to. It really is pretty clear that if people satisfy the rules that everybody else satisfies in terms of the application procedures, and as long as they're not going to actually incite violence, I mean, as I recall, the American Nazi Party tried, I think the town of Skokie tried to make the case, well, if you come in here, we don't care whether you're going to be violent, or we do care that. We understand you're promising not to be violent, but we're worried that other people will be violent to you. The reactions of other people may be very, very violent to seeing the American Nazi Party coming through these streets. You will incite them to violence. You will incite them to try to stop you, maybe throw stones. For all we know, they might be armed. And we don't want to be responsible for this. That was part of the town of Skokie's case in trying to say that, no, this will incite violence. Well, that didn't stand. The American Nazi Party said, you're obliged to protect us from that sort of thing. We are citizens of the United States. We have the right to assemble freely. And if people come up and try and hurt us, it's your business. It's your job to protect us. Now that you mention it, Skokie, we'll need police protection for this rally. And that indeed is the way things were. That's what had to happen. That's what the courts decided, and that's pretty clearly what the Constitution said. So what I want to know now is what you think about this right to free speech when you see it applied in cases like that.
there was any physical violence, but was there still an infringement on their rights? Is that
Infringement on the rights of the residents of
Yeah.
Skokie.
And just living normal lives sanely, and that was causing psychological harm, possibly.
Might cause psychological harm. I'm sure that that was an argument that was made in the town of Skokie. I mean, it's not like, these words, you can imagine what this would do to people. I mean, imagine someone who had actually been through the camps, who had lost many, maybe all the members of their family, who were trying to recover their own lives in a new place, a place where they could forget all that, where they were far away from all that. And suddenly all that comes marching down the street, goose-stepping, same uniforms, same flags, same banners, same speeches, same tone of voice, same salutes, same everything. You can imagine the psychological damage that would be done. But no, that was not decisive. It certainly was brought up, but I think the court decided, no, I'm sorry. I mean, we understand all that. We don't want them to march. We don't want them to march in Skokie. We would prefer it if they didn't march anywhere, but it is their right. Now, the reason I bring this up is I want to find out whether you think that the right to free speech should allow that kind of thing. Paul?
Unfortunately, I think so. I think it's one of the bad parts to it, but that's free speech. I think what the best thing that the public could have done in that situation would be not to even fight it. Just go ahead, march, and not attend it, not paying attention to it. Just blow it up. And even if you wanted to go farther, just help them set up. Do something that would just completely diffuse the whole Nazi Party's reason for going there.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'd be like, "What's our point?" And plus, by allowing for such an evil to just march through, it would just show to the public or people who maybe didn't know what the Nazi Party was about exactly what they are, and I would think it would just make people despise them more.
Mm-hmm.
So it would end up hurting them more than aiding them. So I think you have to allow for different expressions,
Okay.
good or bad.
Well, I think no matter how repellent their ideas are, that doesn't make their ideas any less valid than anything that we have.
Valid meaning what?
They're entitled to what they think, and they're entitled to speak what's on their mind.
Okay. What would be an invalid? I mean, that's a use of valid that I think is pretty common, but it's always confused me. By valid, you meant it's an idea, and there's nothing so wrong in having the idea. I don't mean mistaken now, but there's nothing morally wrong or socially prohibitable about having and wanting to express an idea, if especially if they truly believe this stuff. I want you to try to express. I mean, I don't know. I'd hope to find out whether there's anybody who thinks differently, who's not really so sure that the right to freedom of expression should go that far. It's tough, and what I hoped to do by using that example is to just show you it may be that it's not so clear that the consequences of free speech would always be positive. Now, think about this. There's a couple of different ways to think about this, and I'd also like it if you'd frame your reactions in terms of the same distinction we went over earlier. The utilitarians, or at least the consequentialists, would say that it has to do, what we're trying to decide whether we should have this law, this First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which protects free speech. We need to try to assess what would be, in the end, or all things considered, what would be the consequences of that. Would having that law written in such a way as to protect even the Nazis, is that what produces the greatest good for the greatest number? Or would maybe having a law that protected free speech up to some point short of that, maybe a point of the kind, something like what Dan mentioned, maybe when likely harm, even psychological harm, can be demonstrated, maybe that should be sufficient to rule out giving the parade permit. I mean, maybe we should say, all right, you can express your views in other ways, in other places, but because of the location you've chosen, we think that the harm that would be generated by this parade, the psychological harm that would be generated by this parade, would be great enough as to rule out our giving you a parade permit. Maybe we should modify the right to free speech in such a way so that it includes that. What do you think? That's the kind of alternative I'm looking for. Dan, other Dan.
I was just trying to say, like, I remember like a few lectures back, you were talking about like when we're running the government, usually the people don't know what is best to make the law, so we need like lawmakers to make it for us, make really good laws for us. And so I think like some of these situations can apply to, maybe sometimes the people don't know what's best for them, so maybe we shouldn't have this theory. I mean, the Nazi part, yeah, I understand that part. I can't think of a situation right now, but some other kind of situation where the people don't know what's best for it.
So, let me see if I can understand what you're suggesting. Is that sometimes maybe the government should be empowered to prohibit parades of this kind. I want to keep things focused on this parade issue.
Okay, well, this kind of situation, yeah, I think your theory could apply, but I'm talking about like
the theory.
other
What
kind
theory?
of situation. I can't think of one. But sometimes maybe what the majority thinks is not really the right answer. Sometimes.
You're saying stuff that seems to me to be relevant to this, but I just don't see how it all comes together. Can you, in a brief sentence, answer this question? What is it that you're suggesting concerning the right to free speech? Should it stand, or should perhaps it be modified in some way? That's an alternative. I was asking you which.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty complicated.
Give it some more thought. Yeah.
I don't really think you could amend free speech to include psychological damage. Because what if the American Nazi Party turned around and said, someone in a predominantly Nazi town somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
What if someone came in preaching tolerance? Is it, you can't do that because we're bringing our children up to hate a certain group, and it's psychologically damaging for them to be taught tolerance.
Interesting that you should bring this up. Because there's this other town just outside of Chicago. This one's on the south side. It's called Cicero, Illinois. The town of Cicero, Illinois was, anyway, in the 60s, not just predominantly, but exclusively white. Now, the south side of Chicago had become increasingly the place where the black population began to grow. Began to grow as people immigrated from the south. It was a big city. It collected people because people look for jobs. They go to the big city thinking that they'll get them. And sometimes they do, but as often as not they don't. But there are also support facilities in the city, so that it's probably a better place to go if you're hard up than to stay out in the rural regions, especially if the rural regions are collapsing economically, as happened in the 30s and to some extent in the 40s. But the black population of Chicago grew especially during the middle of the 20th century. And the south side was one of the parts of Chicago that became increasingly populated by African Americans. Now, Cicero, Illinois, had been there for quite some time, had a long tradition of being a proud not rich, but a proud white community. They got pretty violent about this sometimes. I mean, if black families ventured in, if someone mistakenly tried to investigate the possibility of renting an apartment in Cicero, Illinois, and they were black, they were putting their lives and the lives of their families at risk just by venturing in there. It was a good idea if you were black to stay away from Cicero, Illinois. And the townspeople in Cicero, Illinois, felt themselves very, very threatened as one town, one area after another in their vicinity began to become dominantly populated by black people. They felt that their whole way of life was at risk, that their culture, if you like, their town was at risk. And Martin Luther King got wind of the things that the people of Cicero, Illinois were doing to black people, and the prohibitions against black people working there, black people living there. These are violations of the law now. Some of these things weren't violations of the law then, and the changes because of people like Martin Luther King in large part. But what Martin Luther King decided to do was to have a parade. He wanted a parade of people who felt that this policy in Cicero, Illinois was unjust, that it was wrong. And he wanted to have this parade in the streets of Cicero, Illinois, and he wanted to rally in the town square in Cicero, Illinois. Now the town of Cicero said, "No, you can't do that. It's not right. I mean, you're going to really, you're going to really upset people here. We don't want to have a parade of what will probably be mostly black people, and in the event it really was. There were all kinds of people there, but the largest number of paraders were black. But we don't want those folks to come into our area. We're really worried that we're going to lose our town, and there's older people here who have lived here all their lives and whose families have always lived here. And can you imagine the psychological damage that would be done to those people if they see the streets flooded with black people, led by Martin Luther King, and a rally in the town square? I mean, this is going to do a great deal of psychological damage. And of course, once the town of Cicero tried to stop the parade, and Martin Luther King, supported by the ACLU in this case too, took the case to court. And of course, the courts ruled in the same way, that of course they have a right to parade in the public streets of Cicero, Illinois, and rally in the public park of Cicero, Illinois. That's the Constitution. And what that does is that emphasizes, I think, just exactly what your point is. I mean, that's a real case. It's not just, you don't have to imagine some Nazi town where they're educating the kids to be Nazis. I mean, there are situations like that. And that's why I think most people's reaction to the whole idea of protection of free speech, most people emphasize and think first and foremost of what Mill does not emphasize. That's this idea that, look, of course we will be upset by lots of things that we allow if we allow free speech and free assembly. We'll be upset by lots of those things. But if I am empowered to stop you in your expression of your free speech, then the very mechanisms that I use to stop you can be used by you to stop me. Now that's the main justification, I suppose, in most people's minds for having the doctrine of free speech, even though everyone admits that there's going to be lots of stuff we don't like out there. We don't want to empower anybody to prevent the expression of ideas, as loathsome as those ideas may be, just because that body could then stop ideas that we think are good. and noble. But that's not what Mill spends most of his time on. Now, I wanted to spend time on that just because you didn't get much of that in Mill. But Mill, being a consequentialist, tries to explain why my suppression of your free speech is in my allowing you to express your free speech, even when you disagree with me in the most extreme possible ways. It's in my interest. Yeah, Paul.
Right. I remember reading about that because even something that seems completely wrong adds a part to the truth of the perceived truth to give you a greater truth.
That's one of 4 arguments he offers. And what I want to do in closing is to just sort of quickly summarize those 4 arguments, which he expresses so eloquently in On Liberty. I really urge you to go back and look at his own prose. It's really unmatchable. But there are 4 grounds that he offers for freedom of expression. And I want to emphasize again that these are not just reasons why we should have laws protecting freedom of expression. This is something more important. This is why we as a community should not only tolerate but encourage the expression of ideas that we disagree with. I mean, this is not just about laws. In fact, that's one of the interesting things about Mill's argument. He, at the very beginning, makes it clear that there's a couple of different ways that people can be suppressed. One is by law, but the other is by public opinion. There are ways in which opinions can be molded and shaped. One is by oppressive law, but another is simply by public opinion. Public opinion is very dangerous. This is something that became apparent once we had widespread practice of democratic institutions. Observers of the American experiment who came over from Europe were often in awe of how interesting it was, but they came away a little bit, and they still do, they come away a little bit bemused, a little bit concerned, because they say, look, the Americans, they're free. They're free to be different. They're free to be themselves. But I've never run into a society where people are less different. People really are conformists. Public opinion rules America. Now, a lot of that, I think, is excessive. I think there's a lot of exaggeration in that portrayal of American society. But it's something that Americans and Englishmen alike, because the English were going through the same experiment, were becoming concerned with in the 19th century. That as public opinion began to dominate politics, it also seemed to begin to be evident as a force in its own right in molding people, making it hard for people to live lives that were different. Public opinion, not law now, public opinion was suppressing freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom to be different. And that's where Mill's argument comes up. He's arguing not just for laws that take a certain form, he's arguing for a genuine tolerance, even a genuine encouragement among people of variety, of different, of the promotion of different ideas. This is good and healthy. This is what's best. This is what, in the end, will lead to the greatest good for the greatest number. Why? 1, the oppressed, the suppressed, or oppressed. Now, suppression I'll use to indicate suppression by law. Oppression, rather arbitrarily, I'll use to indicate when our public opinion, just simply oppresses the creates a situation where it's very, very difficult for people. People feel eternally uncomfortable about expressing themselves because they will be looked upon as fools, they will be laughed at, they will be ridiculed, they will be ostracized. That's a thing that the public has in its power to do, even if the laws permit people to express themselves. The suppressed, or oppressed, I should say, not oppression, the suppressed or oppressed view, the first reason, plainly, is it might be true. It might be right. And beliefs aren't these arbitrary ornaments that we just sort of have decorating ourselves. Beliefs serve a purpose. The reason people have beliefs is to guide action. And if there is a dominant view in society that is incorrect, then action in that society will be guided wrongly. So it's important to society, it's important to all of us that everybody be encouraged to express their views on the subjects that are vital to us, because their view might be right. So that's the first thing. But these become more interesting as we go down the list. Even if they're false, and this is what Paul pointed out, it probably contains a partial truth. It's not likely that we've got all the truth, even if we're mostly right. It's not very likely that we're entirely right about everything. And different people from different perspectives can help us understand the different sides of the truth as they express things from their point of view. We can get a better handle on the truth, whatever the doctrine is, if we promote. And it's important to us to get, microphone. It's important for us to get a handle on the truth, the best grip we can. And if we insist on shutting other people up, we won't stand as good a chance of getting a better handle on it. We won't see things from those other sides. Now, let's go to the other side. Even if the dominant, I'm going to keep thinking of that. Even if the dominant opinion is completely true, well, this is a challenge. I mean, sometimes maybe we're completely right. Even if we were completely right, it would be held, I'm going to try and get this exactly in Mill's words because they're important. It would be held in the manner of a prejudice if not vigorously and sincerely contested. I mean, these two, number 3 and number 4, we'll get to 4 in a second. Number 3 and number 4 have this in common. I mean, I want to give you an example. I mean, what does do they still, in your experience, they still make every kid say the Pledge of Allegiance at the beginning of class all the time in grammar school? Some shake their heads no, some are nodding yes.
You don't have to, though.
You don't have to? That's an interesting school. But some schools, especially in the lower grades, they when I was a kid, they made you stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance every class period. Now that, it might be, regardless of what your thoughts are about the Pledge of Allegiance, the question here is how much did that just become a rote thing that kids did without thinking about it, without thinking of the meaning of it, without thinking of the point? People have all kinds of opinions, religious opinions, opinions about justice, opinions about many, many different things that are simply the product of rote memorization. And what Mill argues is that unless there are people out there, unless I know that there are other options, then the opinion I hold, I may not have any good reasons for it. I may not have any reason to see why it is right or anything. I mean, I'll just repeat it. Yeah, of course I believe it. What's the alternative? I mean, if you don't know about any alternatives, then you will be holding that belief in the manner of a prejudice. Even if you're right, even if it's the correct view, you're not holding it for any reasons at all, let alone for good reasons. You're just holding it because you've been reciting it all the time, and everybody around you says it. And you sort of absorb it like you breathe the air. And it's no longer something that does any work in your life. And that's bad for beliefs that really are important in guiding us from one thing to the next. And lastly, this is related.
Can you move it up?
Yep. The very meaning and significance of the belief will simply be lost. Now, again, I'm not saying that the following argument is right, but I'm going to leave you with an example. There's a hotly debated issue about school prayer these days. Not as hotly debated as sometimes, but I'm sure it's going to keep coming back. Whether that should be required, allowed, banned, what in the schools. It addresses not just the free speech issue, but the issue of separation of church and state, especially in the public schools. One of the arguments against mandatory prayer periods in the public schools reflects this idea of Mills. And it's an argument that was advanced by people who really think prayer is important, curiously. Some people who really think prayer is important in human life did not want there to be mandatory prayer periods in the schools because it would trivialize prayer. It would encourage kids to lose the sense of the significance and the meaning of prayer, in the same way that perhaps kids lose the meaning and significance of the Pledge of Allegiance when they recite it every day at the beginning of class. Anyway, these are Mill's 4 reasons grounding the idea not only that we should have laws that protect freedom of speech, but that it's in our interest to encourage the expression of beliefs contrary to our own. It's not just because if I don't give you that right, you won't give me that right. It's because my beliefs would be impoverished, they would wither in significance, they would wither in their very meaning if there isn't the expression of contrary beliefs against which to weigh my own. And that's it. Any questions or comments